It is good to see you again here remotely. We'd like to continue our lectures on Hinduism in Southeast Asia. Before we talk about Buddhism in Southeast Asia, certainly you can chat while I'm talking. And if you have any questions about anything, email me or use chat here. So last time we talked about Hindu tradition beliefs, generally speaking, and the origins of Hindu traditions, Indus Valley civilization, and the Aryans, immigrants, blending the cultures into different beliefs and rituals and social practices. And then today I'm going to continue that, especially how Hindu traditions came to Southeast Asia and how Southeast Asian cultures shape the way in which Hindu traditions operate. So that's what we call localization, the process of making something foreign or outside local, even indigenous, and their own's. In other words, Javanese Hinduism, Balinese Hinduism, or in other cases, Toraja Hinduism, or Cham Hinduism, and others as well in Southeast Asia. So that's the process of Hinduization, making things Hindu, but at the same time, localization, making Hindu tradition local. So there's always this mostly simultaneous process of the process, of conversion and change and transformation. Okay. As you can see here on the slides that I'm going to share here now, all right. So the term localization, in other words, you have Hindu gods and goddesses, in Sanskrit or in Indian languages, are made local. Of course, you have the terms Deva or Devi for male and female goddess, but then you have local terms, localized Deva or Devi, for example, in the case of Indonesia and Malaysia, it's Malay terms of Sanskrit Indian languages, just an example. So meaning God or goddess. So Dewa from Deva and Devi, and that's just terms for gods. But you also have local terms like HYANG. HYANG means deity. Yeah, HYANG means deity. I don't have it here in the slide later on when I talk about the supreme God. But that's language in terms of local terms of Hindu gods. Then you have caste system, right? We talked about caste system before. Remember the caste system? In India, even though it is not always strict, the caste system, remember, right? The Brahman or the Brahmin priest caste, and then you have Kshatriya, the warrior kings, rulers, Vaisa, some say it's merchants, some say commoners, Sudra, some say is servants. So those four, and plus in some of the places in India, you have the outcast. These four castes, for social groupings, having transferred to Southeast Asia, and then this transfer or transmission of the caste system is not always exact. In other words, many people in Bali, in Champa, in Cham, in Cambodia, in Malaysia, and Singapore, they don't necessarily practice the caste system. All right. So now you have the mixing of cultures. For example, the Brahmin priest would marry local Javanese or local Balinese or local Cham. Then you have this mixture of, you know, of caste. So you don't have really the strict practice of caste system. You have social mobility. So now in Bali, for example, in the on the island of Bali in Indonesia, you have priests coming from you know, merchants, caste, or the ordinary commoner people would become a local ruler or a priest. So you do have a social mobility. So you have this fluidity of the caste that comes from India and becomes fluid and dynamic in local context. All right. So you don't really have a strict practice of caste in Southeast Asia in general. Then we talk about local names. You know, local people appropriate Sanskrit names like Devi or Deva or you know, Varman, for example, or Surya for God from Sanskrit becomes Surya, Varman, for example, in Southeast Asia. So you have local names appropriating or selectively borrowing Sanskrit. Many of these happen to, in the elite, at the elite level, but you also have the popular levels as well. In Southeast Asia, especially in modern time, if you are asked where are these Hindus now, you will find Hindus in many parts of Southeast Asia. You have in Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, Indian, mostly Tamil Hindus. In other words, they come from India, Tamils, who had been in Southeast Asia since the British colonial time, or even maybe earlier, and then they become Hindus in these localities in Southeast Asia. They preserve the religious traditions and cultures from Tamil history and into Southeast Asia. So Indian, mostly Tamil Hindus in part of Southeast Asia. That's number, you know, what we call as South Asian Hinduism in the reading that we assign. Then you have Cham Hindus. Cham Hindus in Vietnam, you know, they practice forms of Hindu traditions there. In Cambodia, in Laos, in Thailand, mostly Buddhist or predominantly Buddhist, but you also have Hindus who preserve the Khmer history and culture. So you had the Khmer Hindus in predominantly Buddhist countries. Then you have some South Indians or Indians who are Burmese in Burma or Myanmar as well. They are all these minority Hindus, okay? They are minorities because predominantly Buddhist country, yeah? And then you have also a very small number of Indian Hindus in the Philippines. And in modern time, after 1960s, 70s, you have the coming of Hindu organization, international Hindu organization like Hare Krishna, for example, from the United States. And then it becomes an international Hindu religious movement all the way to Southeast Asia. Then you have Indonesia. Yeah, you have Hindus in Bali, the the island of Bali. We will talk a little bit more, and the Hindus of Java, Javanese, and then in this particular Java island, you have Tenggeris, one ethnic group. You have also Toraja in in Sulawesi, in eastern part of Indonesia. You have Dayak in Borneo in Kalimantan. You have Batak Karo in Sumatra, North Sumatra, and other Indonesian Hindus. Some suggest that Hindus in Indonesia around 4 million Hindus out of 260 million populations in Indonesia. But Hindu reformist organization suggests there are more than 4 million Hindus in Indonesia. They come up with 18 million Hindus and so on. So you do have some, debate about how many Hindus are actually now in Indonesia. Regardless of the numbering, it is still minority religious tradition in terms of the number, but they are still very important. And remember, the process of Hinduization or Hinduization and also Buddhization, Buddha's tradition, Buddhist tradition had been around in Southeast Asia since the early first century, right? Early Common Era, the first century of the Common Era. So Hindu tradition, Buddhism, and only later on Islam, and then Christianity and other religious traditions. So even though a minority, but they were predominant in the past. Okay, so to make it short, Hinduization were predominant in many places in the kingdoms before the coming of Islam and also Christianity later on. We talk about this little bit, ethnic Hinduism that I already mentioned, from Tamil, South Asian Indians who were Hindus and then preserve Hindu tradition. That's called the author of our book, Winsler, mentioned about ethnic Hinduism, right? That's one version of popular Hinduism. Then you have Balinese Hinduism, Hinduism as practiced in Bali, on the island of Bali. And then you have Neo-Hinduism. Neo-Hinduism refer to movements toward more like Indian Hinduism. So Hindu traditions and organizations which try to be more world and global tradition. So between local Hindus and global Hinduism. And Neo-Hinduism is a reform Hinduism that, of course, it's also very diverse. But in this case, they say that Hinduism is not only the religion of the Balinese. We don't want to be confined to the island of Bali. We want to be like, for example, Islam or Christianity, where Islam is a global religion, Christianity is a world religion. So why not making Hindu tradition that is already in Indonesia is also a world religion? So Neo-Hinduism is a self-conscious reform among Hindu leaders and priests and literate, educated in different schools and universities. They want to be part of the global Hindu tradition. So yes, that's the 3 layers or the 3 versions of popular Hinduism.
Professor?
Yes, go ahead.
I got the impression from the book that a lot of the indigenous people who identified as Hindu did it as a way to have their indigenous religion recognized as an official religion in Indonesia. Is that the case?
So you say it again, just one more time.
I thought the book was implying that a lot of the Indonesian people who registered as Hindu registered as Hindu in order to get their indigenous religion recognized by the state.
Right. Right. So this is because, okay, I just want to make clear, especially for others, right? So you have in Indonesia state philosophy of Pancasila, where the 5 pillars, Pancasila, which require the first pillar of the state philosophy, belief in one God. So it's monotheistic, yeah. And then the first time, 1950s, some of these Muslims, leaders, nationalist leaders, they felt that the religious tradition in Bali was not really monotheistic or not really organized, right? So that's why, the indigenous Hindus, they wanted to be recognized by the state. Yeah. Um, that's why you have uh, rationalization and making Hindu beliefs more monotheistic, that I'll talk more later on, so that they become recognized, meaning that they would become part of the state ministry of religion. Because in Indonesia, you have the ministry or the Department of Religious Affairs. We don't have here in the United States, right? Like a ministry or the department, in charge of religious affairs, because it's a secular state. But in Indonesia, it's a semi-secular state in the sense that they have this ministry of religion. And then, the government, try to organize all religions, all the existing religions, and then they support the recognized religions, including some of the indigenous Hindus who wanted to be part of the nationalistic, monotheistic religions. Yes, that's a very good point. So that's still the case now. Although now you have the Hindu organization, Parisada Hindu, DHARMA, that's a term for the organization that tried to reform Hindu tradition from being polytheistic to become more monotheistic, according to the state philosophy, that religion has to be monotheistic in some way. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on, but that's a really good question from the reading. Yes. Okay. And the next one, okay, this is ethnic Hinduism. I already mentioned, right, about Tamil tradition. And this is one of the festivals also you can find in India and Tamil South Asian cultures. And then you will have also in part of Malaysia, Singapore, and in Indonesia as well, in part of Indonesia, where you have the festival. And then you have the Indian elites and reform Hinduism that I already mentioned, reform. Reform meaning that you want to change something, right? To reform society based on certain correct beliefs and practices. You want to make sure that people, subscribe and observe the correct or true Hindu tradition. One of the readings that I gave to you, it's about true Hinduism, right? What is true Hinduism? What is the correct Hinduism? Like what is a true Christianity, like a true Islam, or true, and that kind of movement try to change the people's practices according to what they believe as the true doctrines, the true teaching of their religion. That's happening also in Hindu traditions. So in Indonesia, I already showed you earlier this, temple. It's called Chandi in local term. From of course from Indian language, from Indian term, Sanskrit term. Chandi, which means temple. So you have a Hindu temple. At least from the early time, this is one of the temples focusing on the belief and the worship of Shiva. And also you have the stories of Ramayana. Remember again the Ramayana story that we already talked about, the story of husband and wife. And of course, there's another element of that story as well. And I had to talk about these Hindu temples in Java. Yeah, one of the Hindu chandis in Java. And you have the different literature, local literatures, influenced by Hindu ideas, as well as Buddhist ideas. Because in Southeast Asia, some of the traditions and literature and architecture have been influenced by both Hindu and Buddhist traditions. That's why there is a conflation of Hindu-Buddhist civilization in the early history of Southeast Asia. Some people don't want to distinguish Hindu part from the Buddhist part, for example. But we haven't really discussed Buddhist tradition, so we will wait until later, okay? But for now, at least, Hindu belief and practice influence literature, influence writings, yeah, influence poems and literature, stories, even arts, dance, songs, practice in Southeast Asia, regardless of their religious identities. If some Muslim Christians would also appropriated some of this Hindu and Buddhist literature for their own purposes in their own local context and for for different times period. So I already mentioned about wayang before, right? Wayang, the shadow puppet, yeah, the shadow puppet that which means the shadow yang is from spirit and offering and its contact with the spirits, and you have a different figures, Semar and Petruk, for example, and Arjuna, Rama, Sita, Sinta, and Panji. Those are the figures in the wayang stories that have been popular in Southeast Asia, especially in Indonesia and part of Malaysia. They represent different characters with humors, with stories about friendships, about kinship, and so on and so forth. So these wayang stories usually are in the context of the Ramayana and Mahabharata stories that we already talked about earlier. So, for example, Rama and Sita, husband and wife in Indonesian shadow puppet. So you see, this shadow puppet. And this shadow puppet show is very popular in different parts of Indonesia, as well as in parts of Malaysia, but mostly in Indonesia. So from Hinduism as a Balinese religion, you have Hinduism as an Indonesian religion, so wider religious tradition. But before that, let's talk about a little bit more about Hinduism in Bali. So Hindu Dharma is the term that sometimes many would say, or Agama Hindu Bali, the religion of Hindu Bali, or the religion of Balinese Hinduism. And I want to remember, I want you to remember the term for religion, Agama, right? This one, AGAMA, Agama, which is Sanskrit term for, before literature, scripture, tradition, teaching. But in Indonesia and Malaysia and also part of Southeast Asia, Agama becomes religion. Yeah, so that's why religion of Hinduism, Agama Hindu, religion of Christianity, Agama Kristen, for example, the religion of Islam, Agama Islam. So you have the word Agama meaning religion in our context. So this is the island of Bali, okay? So it's a small island near Java, the island of Java. You have about 17,000 islands in Indonesia. 2/3 of the 2/3 of Indonesian archipelago is the ocean, and you have islands. And Bali is one of the islands, small islands, close to Java, the Java island. So the term Agama Hindu Dharma, or the religion of the Hindu in Bali, then becomes Indonesian Hinduism later on. So you have the term Agama, I already mentioned. You have Dharma, which means teaching or doctrine or order. And in Hindu tradition, generally speaking, but also in Bali and Indonesia at large, you have a different paths. So different Hindus would focus on different paths. For example, some would focus on devotion, meaning devotion to one particular god, Shiva, for example. And then you have the path of knowledge. They it's one of the paths toward liberation or moksha. You basically, you learn this, you learn the scripture, you learn the teachings, and this is through learning that you would hopefully achieve liberation. Then you have also people or Hindus who focus on the work or action or karma. So, the karma marga, or the path of the work. Then you have some or many Hindus who focus on meditation. So through yoga or different terms, meditation is one of the paths toward liberation. So this is just an emphasis, like a different degrees, different paths that some Hindus or other Hindus would try to do in order to achieve liberation. So the ultimate goal is liberation. Liberation from bondage, liberation from rebirth, from reincarnation, from samsara. Remember that? And then you have this ultimate goal to be liberated. You also have other goals, moral living, dharma, meaning to act righteously in this life, and then artha, wealth. So it's also it's also a good thing. It's also something that Hindus would pursue. And they also have karma, joy and love. So to attain happiness through moral teaching, through accumulation of wealth, in other words, being Hindu doesn't mean that you are ascetic, that you are simply away from the world. You also need to engage the world. And artha is one of the goals that many Hindus would also pursue. And also karma, happiness and joy and love in society, for example, or in a family, parents and children and so on. So moral living, and also live in a prosperous life, and also in a joyful life. It's also are some of the goals. And then of course the moksha, the liberation, is the ultimate goal for many, and if not all, Hindus in Southeast Asia as well as in India. So this agama, dharma, and moksha are some of the key doctrines that you would find in Bali, also in other parts of Indonesia. Another way of understanding Hindu doctrines in Indonesia in particular are through these 5 pillars, PANCA SRADHA. So PANCA SRADHA, of 5 pillars, consists of belief in God, which in India referred to as Brahman, especially in the Upanishad, and Atman, number 2, soul, the soul. So you have God, and then number 2, Atman, soul. Then you have karma, the energy, the cause and effect that I already discussed earlier. Number 4, samsara, cycle of birth and rebirth, and moksha. So Brahman, Atman, karma, samsara, and moksha are considered the 5 pillars in the Hindu official predominant or mainstream Hindu beliefs system in Indonesia in particular, and also in other parts of the world. So in Bali, how Bali, the island of Bali, has become predominantly Hindus, some say 88% or 95% of Balinese are Hindu, used to be low Hindu kingdom in Java, retreated, from the island of Java, then moved to Bali around 1500. Because of that time, some of the Hindu Buddhist kingdoms like Majapahit had become Islamized, or declined through the Islamic kingdoms. So the Islamic kingdoms like Demak in Java, for example, and other Islamic kingdoms, became a threat to these Hindus in Java. Then they migrated to the island of Bali. That's why Bali, had become at the time mostly Hindus. So in Bali, people say the religion is a mixture of Hinduism originated from India and also Java, through Java. And then you have some of the indigenous beliefs in Bali itself. We call indigenous religious belief and practice. So all this, all these influences make up the Hindu religion in Bali. And in Bali, you have a supreme deity, a supreme God. I'll give you the name SUBAK Vidhi SUBAK Vidhi. And this supreme deity, supreme God, it is monotheistic God, but this monotheistic belief actually has different nuanced interpretations, and one God has many manifestations. Or some say, polytheistic, but at the same time monotheistic. So, for example, I give you an example. Some people in Bali, Hindus in Bali, when for example, during the harvest, they would call the gods, especially the goddess Betari Dewi Sri, goddess of rice and fertility. So Betari Dewi Sri, goddess of rice and fertility. And then you have also other god by the name of Betara Vishnu. Vishnu is very important by the one of this irrigation, taking care of the irrigation. And then the Tara of Shiva, focusing on the dead. So different gods have different functions. Yeah, different gods and goddesses have different functions according to the belief of the society themselves. But they all represent, or they all are the manifestations of one supreme God. In India, we know Brahman, the one God in the Upanishad, for example, or Brahma in other term, the creator God. But in Bali, this one God has many manifestations. And these manifestations are according to the local and also according to the function, different functions in the daily lives of the society. This is the name that I already mentioned, SUBAK Vidhi. Okay, the one God that you will find first in the Bali, and then it becomes the one God of Hindus in Indonesia at large. SUBAK Vidhi. Originally, you have the term sang. It's a honoring label. So when you have a sang, meaning is honor, respected, highly respected. So it's to respect. Then you have HYANG. HYANG means deity or God or spirit. And and you have WIDHI, yeah. WIDHI actually knowledge, from knowledge, so the all-knowing, and WASA, or power. So this God is described as the powerful, the most knowledgeable, or the all-knowing, the all-powerful, and becomes Sanghyang Vidiwasa. And this might be related also um, to an Indian term for the one God, the unconceivable, the undivided, the uh, Achintya. So Achintya is the Sanskrit God, the Sanskrit term for God, for this one God, uh, described as the divine order or the divine oneness. So Achintya has become Sanghyang Vidiwasa in Bali and Indonesia. Achintya of India has become Sanghyang Vidiwasa in Bali and in Indonesia at large. So maybe this is how, Balinese Hinduism still in conformity with the Indian Hinduism. And of course, we talk about Brahman, the one God that you can find also in the Upanishad, one of the scriptures, Upanishad. Sanghyang Vidiwasa, this all one supreme God, the Almighty God, the all-knowing God, has been described as the source of light. That's why the representation of Sanghyang Vidiwasa usually as the sun, the sunlight, and is considered the source of light because God is considered the remover of darkness and ignorance. So this is how God or deity, a supreme God in Bali in Indonesia has been interpreted theologically, but also philosophically. You do have some interpretations, known interpretations about how this God relate to humans and nature, but this is the basic understanding of how Sanghyang Vidiwasa, one supreme God, power with power and knowledge and light that you will find in Bali and also in parts of Indonesia in particular. All right, so by now I already discussed more and more about the Balinese Hinduism. So to summarize, so you have in Bali, Hinduism becomes a monotheistic religion, right? With emphasis on the supreme God, right? Although this one God has manifestations, yeah, different manifestations with regard to rice and fertility, irrigation, with regard to ancestor spirits, and so on and so forth. So this one supreme God, that's one point about Balinese Hinduism. Second point is about ritual, about worship, that Hindus would worship. Sambah is a term, to worship this one God. And then you have the priest, yeah, the Brahman priest, functioning as the, as the authority of the religious tradition, reciting the prayer, reading the, reciting the scripture, for example, in both original Sanskrit, Pali, Sanskrit, and also Javanese, old Javanese term or Hindu terms, Indian Balinese language and terms. So you have the Brahman priest also functioning in society. In the popular level, sometimes priests do not exist, or in other words, they use a popular ways of performing certain rituals. And then you have the temple called Pura, and there are about more than 20,000 temples on the small island of Bali itself. And you also have a different types of temple in Bali, house temples. In other words, the temples, near the house, each house would have a temple. Then they also have their own, prayer and offering and ritual. Then you have temples in the villages, and then you have temples on the island, and you have also, a bigger temple like the temple of Prambanan, for example, near Yogyakarta, considered to be the Hindu temple for many Hindus around Indonesia. So you have a smaller, and then larger and larger temples in Indonesia. Then you also have sculptures and statues, for example, representing different gods and goddesses. For some, or for many, they represent either the consort of one particular god. You also have the goddess of knowledge, of arts, of science, for example, Saraswati. And you have this statue. And then you also have other, gods, like Ganesh, for example, and the elephant-headed god, the remover of obstacle that you also find. You also have other gods and goddesses. This particular goddess, Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge, music, art, and wisdom, and she helped Brahma god and Vishnu and Shiva, for example. And the importance of a goddess and goddesses in the pantheon of gods among Hindus. All right, so far we've talked about the belief systems, gods, goddess, temples. How about ethics? Yeah, we do have ethics, Hindu ethics, but we can talk about this in a simple way. There's a notion of being hospitable, showing hospitality to guests. And this is enacted, for example, not only in the ritual, but also in the daily life of Hindus in Bali and other parts of Indonesia and Southeast Asia. Hospitality, being hospitable to your guests. Family values also, the importance of love and taking care of your kin, your family members, parents, children's, relatives. Family values are very important. Tolerance and coexistence, to tolerate other religions and cultures, for example. Even though, in Bali in particular, you have mostly Hindus, you also have Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and others as well. And also, of course, especially after the tourists, booming to Bali, you have also foreigners coming to Bali. And resilience, to preserve, self-control. That's one of the moral influences also you can get from the Bhagavad Gita, from the scriptures, from the laws of Manu, for example, according to Hindu beliefs. You also have the belief in good and evil, forces. When we talk about good and evil, sometimes we see as contradictions. They are different, but to live as a Hindu, it is about how to strike a balance between good and evil spirits. And you also have the evil, the belief in the evil, like demons, for example, Bhuta and Kala. That's the two famous Bhuta and Kalas, are demons. That they try to get rid of them and then try to protect them from the evil forces. But at the same time, the ritual that they do sometimes, it's the ritual that Hindus would do, is to make a balance between the good and this evil spirit. That's why prayers, offerings, and ritual at large, including the festivals, the religious festivals, were aimed to keep balance at the individual levels and also in the communal, at the communal levels. That's also one of the reasons why they venerate the ancestors. and then the spirits of the ancestors. One of the famous names for this ancestor spirit, Betara HYANG. The Betara HYANG represents the ancestor spirit, and that's why they venerate the ancestor spirit. Another element of Hinduism in Bali is that the society is socially organized, socially hierarchical. So, but again, the caste system is not very rigid. Some even say, ignore caste system altogether because social mobility exists, as I mentioned earlier. So in Bali and Indonesia at large, the rigid caste system is not really applied or practiced. Some of these offerings, in order to appease gods and protect themselves from any evil forces, would include offering thanks, but also dance and music and performance. In the ceremonies, you have people participating in, and then you have different functions, male and female participants would join the ceremonies, mostly part of the life cycle rituals, birth, initiation of you become a boy or girls, mature, then marriage, and then death, funeral. So life cycles have the different rituals associated with each of them. The worship itself sometimes, the worship in Hindu traditions would include prayers, and one of the famous one of the famous prayers in Hindus in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, Om Swastiastu, oh God, I pray all goodness comes from all directions. And of course, the greeting, the popular greeting among Hindus and by Hindus to others, Om Santi, 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 may peace everywhere. So, but then you have the festivals, the three major festivals, Galungan, and then Kuningan, Nyepi, also Saraswati, the three major festivals in Bali. One of them is Galungan. The Galungan is to celebrate the victory of the truth or Dharma over the darkness, over the falseness. And this particular festival is calculated according to the 210-day Balinese calendar and lunar calendar. So 210-day Balinese calendar. So this is the end of the year rather than the new year. So Galungan celebrate them. So in particular, Galungan, this festival commemorate ancestor spirits visiting to the earth, visiting them in the earth, and then they return to the spiritual world from the earth. So the peoples have to show their hospitality to these spirits, ancestor spirits, and by the ways of prayers and offerings. So this is a festival to commemorate the ancestor spirit visiting and returning from the earth. This particular holiday or festival, religious festival, is related to Diwali. The Diwali is pan-Indian festival performed by or celebrated by different religious traditions, and Diwali is in local term or in local form is in the Galungan festival in Bali, in Indonesia. Then the second one is the Day of Silence, which is the Hindu New Year for the Balinese. It's called Nyepi. Nyepi is the day of silence. So Hindus would, perform a silence. They don't go out of their homes, um, and this is a moment of prayers and family. And this is even for foreigners, for example, in Bali, who visit Bali, they're not supposed to leave the hotels and so on. And during this time, or during this day, they are staying at home, basically. So this is one of the major religious festivals or celebrations in Bali. You have YouTube videos about the ceremonies, of course. We can show you later on. But I want to continue this about the Hindu Balinese. One of the local aspects of social organization in Bali is called SUBAK. SUBAK is basically water management. So this water management is for paddy fields. They consider rice as the gift of God. And this SUBAK, as you can see, on the slides, you have a water management system. It's beautiful, but also religious in many ways. This is the relationship between ritual, nature, and the community. So you have the, usually the temple around this SUBAK. And this is one of the uniqueness of Balinese tradition you don't really find in other parts of the world. And one of the pura, one of the temples in Bali is called BESAKIH. And this is a cleansing ritual. So once every 10 years and once every 100 years. And this is one of the, very celebrated ceremonies in not only in the village and villages, but also in the on the island of Bali and also in Indonesia as a national thing. So one of the ritual at the Pura BESAKIH in Bali. All right. By now, I have alluded to or referred to as the Balinese religion in relation to Indonesian nationalism, right? The Indonesian nationalism has Ministry of Religion, has the Pancasila, the belief in one God element, and then you have the reform movement by the Hindu themselves, the Parisada Hindu Dharma movement. So Ministry of Religion, the state philosophy of Pancasila, one of them believe in one God, make this Balinese religion unique, and Balinese reformist movement also very unique to Bali and Indonesia. In Java, you have Tengger people. The Tengger people consider themselves Hindus in a Javanese. It's not in Bali. So now you have a Javanese, especially Tenggerese Hinduism, which also is very interesting case of the combination of religion and custom and culture, and also Hinduism and local beliefs and practices, right? So you have a blending and a combination, hybridity of religious traditions in Tengger. Yeah, this is another aspect of reform movement in among Hindus. The Parisada, the Hindu tradition, the Hindu organization. We try to register birth, marriage, death, giving education to the children, offering religious, providing religious materials for education, for the dissemination of Hinduism and so on. So it's like a more systematic religious organization. So it's through the Parisada Hindu All right. I think I want to um, have a break for now, showing you, a good video on Hinduism in Bali. Um, Let me, then we will have maybe, if we have time, pollings about Hinduism. Let me show you this. All right.
Hi, I'm Rex Moore with the Motley Fool in front of BMW's self-driving exhibit.
After nearly 2,000 years since Hinduism first arrived, Bali is now the last Hindu stronghold of Indonesia. The process of Islamization began less than 500 years ago. Many of the Hindus of Java fled to Bali to escape the Muslim oppression, which is why less than 2% of Indonesians are, but more than 83% of people in Bali are Hindu. However, after centuries of oppression, the followers of Sanatana Dharma achieved official recognition by the Indonesian state in 1962. Hindu temples in India and Sri Lanka all look like this, with big stacks on top. But Balinese temples, known as puras, are different. They are enclosures with open-air areas for worship. The compounds are all connected with beautifully decorated gates, and each contains thatched shrines, meru, which means towers, and bale, pavilions. These temples in the sacred monkey forest date to the 14th century. The sacred hierarchy is reflected in the organization of the temples, which have an outer zone, in which I was able to film, then a middle zone with the pavilions, and finally the most sacred area, Uttama Mandala, with a shrine to the highest god, Asintya, and a multi-tiered tower. Goa Gaja was built in Ubud in the 9th century, probably as a sanctuary for meditation. It was lost to the jungle for centuries until the Dutch rediscovered it in 1923. A monstrous entrance carved directly into the cave was probably intended to ward off evil. Inside the cave, there is an idol for Ganesh and another for Shiva. Outside, these charming fountains and pools are used in prayer rituals by visitors, but were only discovered in the 50s. These women are preparing offerings. The Balinese Hindus create these daily offerings called kanangsari for temples, shops, and other establishments. The ingredients reflect the three gods of the Trimurti. Shiva is symbolized by lime, Vishnu by betel nut, and Brahma by gambir. In the 16th century, a Brahmin from Java called Miratha built 7 special sea temples, Pura Segara, around Bali to honor the gods of the sea and protect the land from evil. Together, they form a spiritual chain around the island. One of these is Tanah Lot, which is built on an island which is only accessible at low tide. Next to the island there is a cave in which venomous banded crate sea snakes are kept, and they are believed to guard the temple from evil spirits. It's good luck to touch them. The entire temple is supposed to be protected by a giant snake, which was created from Niratha's sash when he made the temple. There is also a sacred spring at the island, at which pilgrims pay for blessings. Another of the sea temples is Uluwatu Temple, which was actually built in the 11th century and is dedicated to the Indonesian supreme god, Asintya, and his manifestation as the Aryan god, Rudra. Balinese Hinduism is officially monotheistic, in accordance with compulsory Indonesian state philosophy of PANCA SRADHA. However, while the chief god of India is known as Brahma, Balinese Hindus, like Neoplatonists in the West, see the one god as unknowable, so they refer to him with the Sanskrit name Asintya, unthinkable, or he who cannot be imagined. Despite the name, he is depicted in art like a sun god surrounded by flames. His appointment of supreme god in the 16th century was most likely in response to the Islamic invaders who were all over Indonesia at the time. Lukat Ni, or flame war, is a centuries-old tradition, resembling an Indian rite to Agni, the fire god, and it falls on the new moon of the Balinese ninth month. The men thrash each other with flaming coconut leaves in order to purify themselves and maintain the balance between man and nature. The Ramayana is an Indian epic, like the Greek Iliad, written about 2,500 years ago, but which may be based on a much older Aryan epic. It is quintessentially Indian, set in India and Sri Lanka, and featuring a battle between monkeys and demons called Rakshasas. Sometime around 870 AD, a new version was written in Indonesia called Kakawin Ramayana, which became hugely popular and prominent in Balinese Hinduism. It is retold in a ballet form called Sendratari Ramayana. This was normally accompanied by the haunting sounds of traditional Balinese wooden xylophones. But in the 1930s, a German man introduced the vocal accompaniment called kachak into the ballet. It is based on the noises of monkeys and was originally used for meditative trances. You can see it performed here at sunset at the Uluwatu temple. I actually saw two versions of the Ramayana ballet in Bali, and both were very moving. I prefer the version without kachak though. The heroic figures of Rama and Hanuman represent two manifestations of the masculine ideal. Rama is an aristocratic ruler, an embodiment of the supreme being, utterly pure and pious, while Hanuman, the monkey, embodies strength and heroic courage, yet also devotion to Lord Rama. There is no evidence for a cult of Hanuman in ancient Vedic India, actually. But this divine heroic figure may be very old and have had the monkey attributes imposed onto him in the medieval period, after which he became hugely popular as a god in India, Indonesia, and elsewhere in Asia. It's hard not to love him when you know the beautiful story. Rama is living in exile with his wife Sita and brother Lakshmana. Sita sees a beautiful golden deer, and Rama goes to catch it. Lakshmana hears a cry of help and leaves Sita alone, at which point the demon king Ravana of Lanka tries to kidnap her, but she is protected by a magic circle, so he retreats. Then Ravana reappears in the form of an old man seeking shelter and deceives Sita and kidnaps her. On his way to Sri Lanka, Ravana is attacked by the bird god Garuda, vehicle of Vishnu. But Garuda is defeated. However, he lives to tell Rama what happened to Sita. Rama then consults the Red Monkey King Sugriva to help him, and they select the powerful white monkey Hanuman as a champion to go ahead to Lanka. Hanuman meets Sita and says Rama is coming to help him. But Hanuman is captured by the demonic Rakshasas. However, Hanuman escapes and burns down much of Sri Lanka before flying away. Finally, there is a huge war between the monkeys and the Rakshasas of Lanka. The result is that Rama kills Ravana with his bow. Then Hanuman rides the body of the defeated king and waves his crown aloft in victory. Thanks for watching.
All right. So as you can see here, you know, the adaptation of the Ramayana story, right? In the performance, and that's very popular in Bali, but also in Indonesia. All right. So we already discussed aspects of Hinduism, and also the transmission of Hinduism to Southeast Asia, and the localization of Hinduism in Bali, on the island of Bali and Indonesia, the beliefs in gods and goddesses, the rituals associated with the beliefs, ethics, social organization of caste, and the non-rigid social organization and social hierarchy, social mobility in the case of many Hindus and Hindus in Indonesia. Let us see if we have any questions, and also I will have quizzes here, but I'll just check if you have a question while I was lecturing. Okay. There was a question about whether 3 festival or 2. All right. On the slide, you have only 2, Galungan and Nyepi. There's one more that I didn't mention on the slide, which is Saraswati festival, in commemorating the goddess of art and knowledge and science, such as one of the other festivals that you know, especially in Bali. Okay, what else? If there's, all right. So okay, so just say you know, you are here, but let's do the polling, okay? And I'll see the polling here, and Hinduism. Okay, let me read the first question, and then I'll launch the poll. How would you describe Hinduism? Okay, here we go. How would you describe Hinduism? Many gods and goddesses, a religion originating from India, scriptural revelation, and Shruti and Smriti tradition, you know, the Veda, and also the other scriptures, including the Mahabharata and Ramayana, or ritual, prayer and offerings to the deities and the spirit, especially in Bali, you have ancestor spirits, caste system, you know, the ruler, priest, merchant, commoners, servants, or the doctrines of samsara, karma, and moksha, or vegetarianism, and cremation after death. All right. Did you see the poll? Okay, good. I got the question at once. Yeah, just vote multiple answers. It's a multiple choice, or you can just pick one, and which one you know represent Hinduism, or which one describe Hinduism best to you after, you know, listening to the lectures and reading the readings. Yeah, you can answer all of them.
Wait, did you say if this is graded?
I cannot see the, those who voted here. So there is no name associated with this poll. Okay, so it's not graded, but this is good to see how, we learn about Hinduism and also other religions later on. Okay, so we have,
Professor, I can't hit the submit button.
Oh.
I answered all 4 questions.
There's 5.
Oh, I only have 4.
So you have a 4 question?
Yes, but I can't hit the submit button. And I heard one of my classmates said that there's 5. I only see 4 on my end.
Okay, number 2, how did Hinduism come and became, how did Hinduism come and become a major religion to many parts of Southeast Asia? Priests, sailors, merchants, people through sea and land routes. Rulers in Southeast Asia converted to Hindu. Divine kingdoms, divine Devaraja, divine kings. Southeast Asian elites, the rulers, the people, the educated, accept and use. Let's see. Southeast Asian popularized the Mahabharata and Ramayana. Rulers build Hindu-influenced temples. And then they celebrate Hindu festivals with local beliefs and rituals. And then number 3, in Indonesia, what 3 versions of Hinduism have become popular? Yeah, this one, only one, answer. South Asian Hinduism, like the Tamil, Balinese Hinduism, and Neo-Hinduism outside Bali, particularly, and in Indonesia and in general. And you have Saivite worshippers of Shiva, and Vaishnavism, the worshippers of Vishnu. By way of explanation, in Southeast Asia, many would follow the Saivite tradition, those who worship Shiva, but you also have Vaishnavites as well, different incarnations of Shiva and also Vishnu, for example. Then you have the elite forms of Hinduism and popular forms of Hinduism. This division is not necessarily strict, but the scholars, some scholars, Robert Winsler, have focused on the popular forms of Hinduism. In Bali and Indonesia, what are some of the specific characteristics of Hindu tradition, not exactly like of those in India? So you have here the festivals of Galungan, one of the festivals commemorating the returning ancestor spirits with hospitality. And then the SUBAK water management connected to gods. The belief in supreme God, HYANG WIDHI WASA, and its diverse manifestations. Maintaining the balance between good and evil forces. And the adaptations of the Mahabharata and Ramayana stories in local context. You also have the language, the Kawi or Old Javanese language and Sanskrit blended, and many ritual prayers are in both Kawi or Old Javanese and Sanskrit language. So there are 4 questions. Let me end poll and see if we can. All right. So let me share the result. So for the first one, how would you describe Hinduism? Many of you answered religion originating from India, and ritual, prayer and offerings to deities and spirits. And then, of course, you have also the teachings of rebirth, cause and effect, or energy, and liberation. Number two, how did Hinduism become a major religion in many parts of Southeast Asia, in the past especially, and also in parts of Southeast Asia in the modern time? So you have here the answers mostly goes to priests, sailors, merchants, peoples. They travel to Southeast Asia through sea and land routes, but also Southeast Asians, especially in the later time, would travel to India in order to learn about Hindu tradition and then return to Indonesia and Southeast Asia to teach and to become priests or to practice Hindu traditions. Rulers in Southeast Asia have converted to Hindu, the Hindu idea of kingship, royalty, the divine king. And then that's the main answers. And then number three, versions of Hinduism. South Asian Hinduism, South Asian, mostly Tamil Hinduism, the ethnic, Hinduism, as the scholar Windsor would call. Then you have Balinese Hinduism as practiced in Bali, and then Neo-Hinduism, like reformist Hinduism, in Bali, but also outside Bali across Indonesia. That's the three versions of popular Hinduism according to Windsor. And then in Bali and Indonesia, some of the characteristics of Hindu tradition, the festivals, one of them. And I see here the belief in Supreme God. Yes. So I see most of you have answers, the belief in Supreme God, HYANG, WIDHI, WASA, and his diverse manifestations. That's a good answer to the question of the unique, belief tradition of Hinduism, especially in Bali and in Indonesia at large. Very good. So I'm glad to see all these answers of the questions, Hinduism and Hinduism in Southeast Asia, particularly in Bali and in Indonesia. We come to an end to our lecture. All right. And if you can just say that you are here or present, I would appreciate it. Because I would save the chat. And I will see you again Thursday. We start lecturing about Buddhism. All right. Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night. Thank you.